Okay, we're back, and this will be our final lecture on a book. We will
Correct.
have one more lecture that will talk about the final assignment a little bit, and talk about how to do the final paper and kind of a course wrap up.
Yeah.
But we're just going to spend this one day on rule number 2, and you should have by now watched the episode of MASH called "Sometimes You Hear the Bullet," which is a really famous episode of MASH. It's actually the episode that sort of made MASH, because it's the first time that MASH or any other comedy
Yeah.
ever had an on-screen death.
Yeah, we're used to now, and if you read any of these onboard or online discussions or chat boards or any of the columns written about the Emmys or something like that, we're used to this debate about whether something is a comedy or a drama.
Right.
And we're used to producers and directors straddling that line in a way to create entertainment. That was new then. And so MASH is breaking ground along with some other shows in trying to mix a fundamentally funny show with a lot of jokes and stand-up pieces with something that really is meant to tug at your emotions.
Do people still watch MASH?
Oh, yeah.
People still watch MASH all the time. When I was in high school, I watched it every night from 10:30 to 11, and I couldn't go to bed without MASH.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just part of the ritual of my childhood, and it's always fascinated me because it's a set of remembrances of the Korean War. It's actually based on this novel by Richard Hooker, which is a pseudonym for an actual army surgeon in the Korean War. But everything about that show is Vietnam era. I mean, all of the values, all of the sentiments, the views of war are all Vietnam. So I almost feel when I watch MASH that I'm getting two wars.
Yep. And it's an attempt to talk in public about a war where you can't really talk about it explicitly without creating instant kind of feedback's not the right word, but by saying the word Vietnam, you're going to get some people who say, I don't need to watch this. I know what these liberal film directors are going to say about this, and you're going to get some people who are saying, well, I'm not going to really need to think about it critically because I agree with everything. But by setting it in Korea, you can make people think about those issues without creating the instant response that you would if you set it in Vietnam.
I mean, Shakespeare did that. Hamlet's about Elizabethan England, but it's sort of about 12th century Denmark.
Well, so Tale of Two Cities is really a tale about London and Manchester, not London and Paris.
Yeah. But 71, I think, was the episode we watched. So that was in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
This was going on.
And it lasts a long time, right? So I grew up with MASH.
Yeah.
And so by the time it ended, I think I was in high school, maybe late high school.
I was a junior in high school when we had our last MASH bash, and everybody wore bathrobes and cowboy hats to school that day. I still remember.
We were not that cool.
Yeah.
But this particular episode, we in some sense wanted you to watch because this is where the line comes from, right? That in war, young men die. That's rule number 1, right? And rule number 2 is doctors can't change rule number 1.
Yeah. And clearly, Heidi Squire-Craft watched a lot of MASH too. I mean, MASH episodes all throughout this book, and really, it's the great novel, movie, and television show about Army surgical hospitals.
Yeah. And so way back when, at the beginning of this course, when you read All Quiet on the Western Front, right? He had influences. He had references. They're the classic novelists of the 19th century in Germany and the poets. And that's who he read in high school. That's who he is used to thinking about, right? Well, for Craft, that's TV.
Yeah.
Things have changed. And so her references are TV references.
And that's a really good point, because all of the novelists up till now have had other novelists and poets that they've read, and how many times have we gotten Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est home refigured? Mm-hmm. And here, from what I can tell, the two great literary influences are MASH and The Sopranos.
Both of which are wonderful.
Both of which are wonderful
TV
shows. But it definitely shows a sort of a new generation of novelists, or not novelists, memoirists, who really grows up in a TV generation, a TV culture, and that can be very powerful in shaping values too.
Yep. And so that's you, right? Because when I talk to students in class, the references they make are not as much Jon Stewart anymore, but Amy Schumer and I don't know, anything on the Sci-Fi Channel, right? They're all
Doctor
or
Who.
actually now YouTube videos have become that way. Doctor Who, and if you think that way, right, the people that our novelists grew up reading are writing extended narratives, right? The people in the 19th century are writing 500-page novels generally,
Or more.
or more.
War and Peace.
Indeed.
1,500
Craft is
pages.
growing up on half-an-hour plots.
Mhm.
And I don't know that affects this book, but one of the things you see in this book is that it's a series of vignettes, kind of loosely tied together chronologically.
Which is exactly what the book MASH is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the book MASH really just looks like 13
Yeah.
or 14 TV episode prefaces
Mhm.
rather than any sort of a coherent novel.
Mhm.
So she is writing in a tradition.
True. Yes.
She's writing in a tradition, but she probably has never read the book
That's
MASH.
my guess. Yeah.
She probably hasn't even seen the movie.
Mhm.
But she's certainly seen every episode of the television shows,
Yeah.
like everybody else who grew up in this generation. She got her PhD in 1996. I got mine in 97,
98.
98. So we're about the same
Yeah.
generation, and we're a generation that probably learned everything we know about the Army from MASH.
Oh, exactly.
And so we have that referent base. Now, this isn't a funny book like
No.
MASH or MASH episodes. I mean, it's not satire,
No.
and it's not an anti-war book.
No, this is one of a kind amongst the books we've read,
Yeah.
right? So almost every book we've read has, in one way or another, been anti-war.
Yeah.
This is not. This is pro. If anything, it's pro-war.
It's definitely pro-soldier,
Yes.
and I don't think it's not a celebration of war. This
No.
isn't.
But it is a kind of, you can imagine her saying mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Which, for those of you too young to remember, is the famous line George Bush says on the aircraft carrier when he thinks the war is won. I don't know, 6 or 9 months after the invasion, whenever that was.
When Saddam Hussein falls
Yeah.
and a democratically elected government
Yeah.
is installed in Iraq,
Mhm.
which turned out was just the beginning of
Right.
the problems because that precipitated the civil war that was
Exactly.
really what we were fighting most of the time.
Mhm.
So what are some of the themes that come out here that are different than what we've seen so
Yeah,
far? Because
so-
this is the sort of one of these things that's not like the other book
Mm-hmm.
for the course.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the themes that I see, so this is one level of looking at the book and interpreting the book, right? And so here we're going to talk primarily about the kind of what she talks about, not how she talks about it, right? And one of the things that clearly comes through is how close a connection she has to home. This is unique. It's hinted at, I guess, in the Clay book. But here it's so clear. She gets letters, she gets care packages, she sends emails, she
Skypes for a half hour
Yeah.
every day. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
really, I mean, in MASH, B.J. Honeycutt would wait 3
Right.
weeks for a letter from his wife about his
And
baby daughter.
occasionally the plot device in MASH, if they have some crisis they have to resolve, you find a way to get a phone call through.
And that's what Radar does.
Yep.
Radar can manage
Yeah.
to get a phone call through in just a couple of hours.
Yes, and that's his great skill.
Yes.
Here you Skype and you just sign up for a session and you have 30 minutes to talk and you get to see your children grow up.
How does that affect the whole idea of camaraderie with your troops?
Yeah, I don't know. I guesses, but we've not been there, right? But what I see coming through here is that you do not have quite as pressing a need to form, well, the word you use is a fictive kinship group, right?
Kinship. Because you have a
Which
real kinship.
Is an imagined family, right?
Right.
Or a created family, maybe. Because you have a real family. You have a real
Right.
family at home who you talk to, who you communicate with.
You don't need a band of brothers because you can call your brothers.
Yeah, exactly.
Anytime.
And this is probably good and bad, right? Because you get to see your husband, you get to see your kids, and yet you now are preoccupied sometimes with problems at home.
Yeah.
You're reminded of what you're missing in ways that you don't really see in MASH, and you don't really see at all in these other novels.
So you think? I mean, she does have
She does.
a cohort here.
Yes.
She has a set of good friends,
Yep.
including the surgeon who really she dedicates the book to.
Yeah.
So she does have
Mhm.
kind of a family in the wilderness.
Yeah.
But every other chapter is about a conversation with home too.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, right? Because she sets those off, or somebody does. It's not clear whether it's her or the editor or the publisher or whatever, but it's a different kind of type. It's a different, it's bolder. It's formatted differently so that you clearly know, okay, that was a war experience. This is not, and yet
It is
that's
a war
a false
experience,
dichotomy.
because your war experience is, figuring out how you're going to deal with the electric bill or whatever is happening at home, and that becomes part of the war experience.
And that's unique in our experience in things we've read. And in the same way, so we were talking earlier, and this kind of bridges into the gender issues. You kind of get a feel here, but what's one thing that's unique is that the person at war is a woman. The person at home who's having to deal with the kids in the refrigerator is a man.
A tough Marine.
A Marine
who's
now a father.
Who certainly, we get the sense that it has been different.
Yeah.
Well, not with the kids, but
that's right.
There have been times when he's been off at war and she's been on the home front.
And like I said, as I've said several times, I've never been there. On the other hand, I have a clear memory. I was in graduate school when the first Iraq War started, and I went to class. And most of the people in my class, as I mentioned before, in that particular class, were these officers who were on their way to West Point, on their way to the Air Force Academy. And despondent is too strong of a word, but it's close, because this is what they had trained for. And they were not in combat. They were studying, at the home front, not with their friends. And partly this is a career thing. They're not going to get promoted because they don't have battle experience. Some of them did because they went to Iraq later when it turned out to drag on. But part of this was just, this is their career. This is what they have wanted to do, as terrible as it is, and they're not getting a chance to do it. And here's this Marine, the male Marine, the person who's stereotypically charging to the front, who's now at home taking care of 2 infants.
And I don't get a good sense of how her husband feels.
Yeah, I don't either.
He's there to provide a contrast, but all we really see is how he supports her during the war. Yeah. One of the very interesting parts in this book is when she's in that convoy going to some other city, and her escort says, "Make sure you fire your gun so you can get your combat action ribbon." And it's like, make sure you fire your gun once so you get a medal. Yeah, because you can take that home. And she doesn't understand why that's important until a little bit later. She realizes that if she has just a little bit of combat experience, she's going to be more effective as a psychologist because the people will relate to her.
Yeah, and that you're right. That is really interesting, because I wasn't sure whether to read that from a gender perspective or from a profession.
A psychologist perspective.
Or from just a respect among the troops question, right? Because if you've got that badge, that makes you different than all of the other people in the military. Makes you in a special club.
But there's got to. I think there's got to be some gender component there. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to imagine the big tough Marine coming in and having a female psychologist and being expected to open up about all these deep and dark things. And I'm wondering how much of an issue that is. You see it somewhat in the novel, that she kind of feels that she's got to be somebody that they trust in order to be effective.
So on the one hand, I could see the fact that she's a woman helping that process. On the other hand, I could imagine the fact that she's not seeing combat hindering it. But I can also get a gender perspective of, I could imagine the scene, and she doesn't write it this way, but I could imagine it. The big tough Marine looking at what I have to imagine is a shorter, perceivable, in his eyes, weaker woman, and him kind of walking over and put his hand on her shoulder and saying, I know you don't know this because you're not quite a soldier, but this badge is really important and this is how you get it. And I know you're probably not going to think of that yourself, so I have to help you out. I don't get that sense from her. And it's remarkable. I don't ever get a sense from her that she feels looked down on as a woman.
Yeah, absolutely. How would this be a different book if it had been written by a man, though? What about this book is does give,
Yeah.
because we chose this book because
Yep.
we really wanted a woman's perspective on memories of combat, and those are hard to get
Yes.
in most of the wars we're talking about because women were not combatants.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some things that are clear, right? Occasionally she hints in this book at the fact that other guys are trying to pick her up.
Yeah.
She always kind of puts it in the context of they're trying to pick up other people,
Yes.
not her.
Right.
But every once in a while you get a clear sense that actually they're trying to pick her up.
Yeah, I think with the one CB or SEAL, that
Mhm.
becomes very clear.
Exactly.
He's trying to put the moves on.
Yeah. And you have to imagine, there are more of these times. She carefully avoids that kind of subject in the book. Mostly there are just hints. I think, so first of all, I think from a male perspective, there have to be times when that happens, right? We know enough about homosexuality to know that there is homosexuality in the military.
And we can even ask and tell.
Yeah, well, now we can.
Recently.
On the other hand, you don't ever read about it, or you almost never read about homosexuality.
Well, we read about it in Goodbye Darkness.
In Manchester, where it was
a career
scorned.
Yeah, it was jail time.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Here, so that's one part, right? That she has to deal with an element of interpersonal relationships that men probably don't have to. I have to imagine, although I do not know, that the kind of language that Clay uses toward women may be less present around the women in this book. I certainly don't see it in this book. It's not clear to me whether that's because it didn't happen or whether because she or her editor is trying to present her as a different kind of person.
Right.
And she talks a lot about going to Mass.
Yeah, the Catholicism, the religious element does come out here.
Mm-hmm.
It clearly, though she doesn't dwell on it, it's something that's important to her.
And she has that, it's not clear if it's a faith crisis, because it's just that one little vignette where she can't pray.
Yeah.
I have to guess this is a bigger issue that she minimizes a little bit. But the other thing that's different, or may be different, is her sense of her relationship to her children and the role that children play. And I think it's different. We don't know because none of the people we read had children when they were in combat. They may have had children when they wrote.
They wrote to children. They involved children in the memory part of it. But they weren't part of what was remembered.
Yeah.
And for her, the home front, not only does she have children, she sees them every day.
Yeah.
She watches them growing up.
Yeah.
She's not completely separated from that family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a much stronger lifeline than there was when you may or may not get a letter every month.
Right. And there is this case where this guy, and I've forgotten what position he had, but the guy, his wife has a baby, and it's a big deal in here.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if that's a gender distinction or it's a communication and distance kind of distinction. But I think she minimizes the gender distinctions. And
I would agree.
It would be interesting to get her kind of in a room with a beer and find out what she said when she's not in print.
Right. Now there is, these are just a lot of short vignettes.
Yeah.
Some of them poignant, some of them about spiders.
Mm-hmm.
But the figure that keeps resurfacing is Corporal Jason Dunham,
Mm-hmm.
who's the only real name. Go to Wikipedia. He's there. You can see his picture. Genuine American hero. Put his helmet on a hand grenade and saved 2 other soldiers' lives.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a brief encounter with him, holds his hand, and then that becomes sort of the touchstone for every other description of combat in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It all comes back to this. And there's sort of a sense of, this is a hero, this is why I'm here.
Yeah. This is the model that other people should learn.
Supporting people like this is what I do.
Yep.
And in the very end, she says that going to his ceremony was the greatest day of her life, his Medal of Honor ceremony.
And this is an understanding of what it means to be a hero that O'Brien would blanch at.
What did O'Brien say?
I think, although, so first of all, we should parent, right? It's not clear to me what O'Brien thinks about Iraq, right? And so conceivable. So part of this is a question of if O'Brien is anti-war or anti-Vietnam.
Right.
And I think to some extent he's anti-Vietnam, rather than anti-war.
In the video we watched last
Mhm.
period, he said that he's not a pacifist,
Yep.
but he's really, really close.
Yeah.
And he says that you should really think hard
Yep.
before you send somebody to kill another human being. But he says he's not completely a pacifist.
And I don't see Kraft thinking hard, which doesn't make her a bad person, but does give this a completely different context, right? She grew up in a context, and she exists in a context where she more or less assumes that the army is doing the right thing.
I get the sense that she almost doesn't care about the geopolitics
Yeah.
of the war.
Mhm.
She's there to support people like Jason Dunham,
Mhm.
who are there, who are heroes, who are doing what they've been asked to do. I don't see any arguments one way or the other about whether we should be in
The
Iraq.
only place I see that, and it's not an argument, it's another vignette,
Mhm.
is the Iraqi who turned his cousin in, I think.
Mhm.
And she just tells this story, right? This is the story where the Iraqi was being kept, depending on your definition, in safety or in custody, tries to kill himself a couple times. She's asked to interact with him so that she can persuade him not to kill himself until they get him to safety. And instead, he is freed and shot later. And the ending of that is a little ambiguous, but really kind of laconic, right?
Yeah.
And there's no political judgment, really, either way.
Much less than in Clay.
Yeah.
I mean, and Clay
Yeah.
isn't a hippie pacifist guy, but
Right.
he definitely sees a whole lot of things wrong with how the war was
Right.
conducted.
Mhm.
And I don't get the sense that Kraft even cares about that. She's like I suppose most doctors are primarily concerned about their patients.
Yeah, and that's another thing that comes through here, and that's another thing that's implied in the MASH episode.
Mm-hmm.
But in MASH, it's a TV show, and you never quite see it, even though it runs some ridiculous number of seasons.
11 seasons. I
Yeah,
think.
and in that sense, Hawkeye never changes, right? There's never any character development. Hawkeye always cares deeply about the people he's trying to save.
Right.
And in this book, what
Frank
you
Burns
see
is always a weasel.
Well, yeah. And in this book, she cares deeply, but you can see her over time get detached, right? The patient's experience are less emotionally impactful for her.
And as she says, that's a defense mechanism.
Yep.
You can't, as a human being, go in and deeply care about people and watch them die over and over again without going crazy
Yeah.
or developing that detachment as a defense mechanism.
And you see that, so you see that in all of these, and in many of these things that we've read, kind of one of the critical scenes of the book is when that detachment is broken, right? So in All Quiet on the Western Front, when they're sitting in the crater, he's sitting in the crater with a guy he's almost killed and is dying.
Mhm.
In the Manchester book, that first scene where he kills his first Japanese and realizing, there are set pieces in many of these where that detachment is broken.
Mhm.
Here, kind of, but it's not really broken until after she's back.
Yeah. So how does she remember combat? What
Yeah.
she remembers combat differently. I mean, everybody remembers it differently.
Mhm.
One thing I don't get from her, and that's probably because this is nonfiction, but I don't get from her the sense that there's any difference between just an accurate report of what
Yeah.
happened and the
I
truth.
agree. With one caveat, which is, of course, she's intentionally not accurate because she's taking all of the identifying.
Right.
She's very clearly obscuring the people she's talking about.
But that's so she won't get sued.
And because it's a part of the kind of ethical expectations for psychiatrists.
Right.
So that's not a literary thing. But yeah, we talked earlier. This reads kind of like a journal.
Mm-hmm.
A journal that's been edited and maybe pieced together.
Now, in a sense, though, she isn't trying to draw morals from most of these things.
No, that's right. She's not trying to create some overall truth.
She's not trying to weave this into a true experience the way that O'Brien or Clay.
That's the
are
interesting
trying to
thing
do.
about the title, right? Because rule number 2 is the moral of that episode.
Right.
And it's the moral in a lot of ways of the whole show.
Mm-hmm.
And she cites it, but it's not the rule of her book.
Right. Right.
And it's not something she tries to teach us.
Right. I think, it's something she's trying to understand herself.
Yep. Mhm.
Because it's one thing Mash constantly brought up, and I think that she brings up, is that in warfare, people don't have normal human problems.
Yeah.
It is not a normal health problem that somebody's body has been riddled with
Right.
shrapnel.
Mhm.
It's not within the expected realm of health crises that a grenade has blown up in your helmet and taken your viscera out.
Mhm.
That these are atypical human issues. And as a psychologist, dealing with people who deal with these issues, normal psychology is, the first thing she tells almost everybody is, what you are going through is not normal.
Right.
Don't normalize this.
Right.
You've got to understand the exceptional nature of what you're going through.
So if you're thinking about how this remembers combat, the difference between her and many of the other stories we've written is that she's not remembering combat. She's remembering the aftermath of combat, right? And one of the things they all say in one way or another is that memory is unreliable because the experience is so extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think you could similarly say memory is unreliable in this book, but it is a far more common kind of issue with memory than the stories we've read before this, right? It is the everyday experience of trying to remember things, which is just as problematic, but we don't think of it nearly as much because it's an everyday kind of thing.
To what extent do you see just the desert environment as part of what she's remembering? A lot of this is about spiders and heat and 130-degree temperatures.
Yeah, the environment's a character.
Yeah.
And the one she's fighting about or fighting against almost more than she is the Iraqis.
I think she only sees one Iraqi in the whole book, and that's the
Yeah, she sees them through other people's stories. That's
Right.
the only time she sees them.
Right. So, and she's not, she's concerned with the soldiers, not really with the Iraqis, but Iraq is something she can't avoid.
Yeah.
And, no air conditioning in 130-degree weather, right?
And we always say Wichita is hot but dry and it's livable. It doesn't strike me that Iraq is the same.
We don't have spiders the size of dinner plates.
Yeah.
But,
there's one thing that it's a little bit off topic, but there's one way in which other memoirs I have read about the experience of combat and the experience of women in combat as cited in other things that does not come through here is the fear of rape and abuse.
Right.
It's nowhere in here.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear that is an issue for women in combat. And I don't know enough about her or her situation to say anything more than it's interesting that it's not here.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time. Any other parting thoughts on rule number 2? I think it was a fitting capstone to the course.
One last thought. The patriotism here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a political agreement about the war. It is a way in which she views the organization she's a part of and her identity as part of that organization is so clearly distinct from the writers we've seen before.
Well, and one real difference is she's still a Navy psychologist.
Yep.
She's still writing this part of that organization,
Mm-hmm.
which means she still has some buy-in, and she probably still has some constraints on what she can say.
That's probably true.
That O'Brien didn't have. She's not going to come out and criticize commanding officers because she could get in big trouble for that, and
she clearly wants blurbs from commanding officers.
She wants blurbs.
Look
from
at the
commanding
blurbs.
officers. So this is the first thing we've read, and I just realized this right now.
Mm.
This is the first thing we've read by a sitting Army, Navy officer. Somebody who has not left that organization.
She works with that organization. I think she retired, but she retired to a different role within it.
Right. She's still employed by the organization, even if she's not a commissioned officer.
And I do interviews all the time for my podcast, and I'm sure she would say the same thing. You get the standard line, my opinions are not to be considered representative of, and yet her colleagues are reading it.
And even if she's not officially representing them, she is.
Yeah.
She wants their business.
Yeah. And
she doesn't want them to, fire her.
Mm-hmm.
So that probably conditions a lot of what we're reading.
Probably so.
This is the closest thing to an insider's view that we've got.
But the other part though is, and I'm thinking. Sorry, I'm pausing because I'm thinking about Clay. But the American Army has changed. Right? The American Army is an insider's game now. The American Army as a professional force, and I mentioned this with Clay, if you just look at it demographically, is far more Southern, far more evangelical, far more patriotic by nature of its selection process than it used to be. And but to
She's
the
a
point,
good white California Catholic.
yes,
Right.
to the point that if you're starting to read stories, mostly in the places like the New Yorker or the Atlantic, speculating about in the long term if this is good for the democracy. And I think that's way too early to talk about. But it does suggest that her experience is way different than O'Brien's or Manchester's.
Right. Okay, well, we hope you enjoyed rule number 2, and we hope you enjoyed watching the MASH episode. And if you don't watch MASH regularly, watch some more. They're really good. Okay, that's a wrap.